Hi, everybody who's here. I'm going to wait maybe about 30 seconds and then I'm going to start. So thanks everybody for coming and for your patience. Hi, everybody. Feel free to put your names in the chat. Say hello to each other. We've got a pretty big group today, and there's a lot of material to cover. So I think I'll probably start now, just do a little introduction. I just want everybody to know that we are recording. So if you have to miss a piece of it, we'll be sure to get this all up on the web as soon as we can. So I guess I just want to say hello. Thanks for coming to the webinar on applying for the Cultural Arts Award Program, which is our first grant program of 2022. I'm Melissa Cerrone, the grants officer for the Office of Arts and Culture. And I'm joined today by some of my colleagues, Diana Rufner, who's going to be running the webinar. I believe Susanna too is here also, and maybe a couple of other people from the office. And I also want to welcome one of our grant writing mentors, who is Allison Flory. Allison works at the YOLO Arts Council. She's a really experienced grant writer and grant maker, and she's going to be helping us provide some support, some extra support for artists and organizations who are applying for this grant program, just to get you through the process. So welcome, Allison, and everybody else here today. So to begin, we're going to walk you through the Cultural Arts Award, or the CAC grant program today. And I know we have folks here today who are both new to our grants program, as well as those who've applied before and received funding in the past. And I really hope that there's something for everybody to grasp here. The program's changed a little bit since you've last applied, so there are going to be some new things. If you've applied before, please take it all in, because we've made some changes to the program since it was last offered in 2018. And it may seem like I'm moving through things quickly if you're new to the program, and a lot of the terminology may seem a little bit unfamiliar. But please don't worry, we're going to have lots of opportunities to support you through this process. So take what you can get here today. We're going to have time for questions and answers at the end, but I really want you to be able to feel supported through this process, because I think once you get into it, it's going to make more sense to you. And as a reminder, this is a webinar, and so all of our guests are in listen mode only. And at the end of the webinar, we're going to have time for Q&A, as I said, and we can unmute you to answer some of your questions, but also feel free to put your questions in the chat not in the chat, excuse me, in the Q&A as we go along. And we'll take some time, probably, maybe midpoint or after a certain section, to look at the Q&A. I probably won't go to it until a little bit later, because I think some of the questions you might have could be answered as we move along. But again, if something hits you as I'm going through it, feel free to put it in the Q&A, and we'll make sure we get through everything throughout the afternoon. Let's see, stay as long as you like. If you feel like you've gotten enough information, feel free to leave at any time. As I said, and the last portion of the webinar is when we're going to go through the application itself. So if you've already gotten into the application and played around with it and you feel really comfortable with it, That's okay. You can feel like you may want to leave at the end of the slides. And again, as I said, we are recording this webinar, and it's going to be archived on our website. It takes a few days to get it up on the website, so be patient. It should be available for viewing next week, and we'll also put the PowerPoint up just to help you remember where we're going. So let's take a look at the agenda for today. First, we're going to talk about what the Cultural Arts Award Grant Program is. I'm going to spend a little time on eligibility because that always seems to be a sticking point, and I've had a lot of questions already come in about who's eligible and who isn't. I'm going to spend some time talking about what's different about this program from maybe the last time you participated in the Cultural Arts Program. Again, we haven't offered a new application since 2018, so things have changed since then, and I want to make sure you understand the differences. We are going to talk about supplemental ARPA support, and I'll tell you what that is if you don't know it when we get to that point. We're going to talk about our new rubric for funding, which is the way our panelists are going to be looking at applications. We'll go through how to apply. As I said, we're going to talk about the application, but I'm going to put that at the end. So we're going to go a little bit out of order. We'll run through support materials, and we may run through that kind of quickly because there is another webinar next week where we're going to dive into media support and be able to really talk about that in more detail. And then we'll just go over some of the deadlines and some of the other opportunities for support and make some time for questions and answers. So next slide, please. Okay, so here we are. What are the Cultural Arts Awards? The Cultural Arts Award Program is actually the longest running continuous grant program offered by the Office of Arts and Culture. I've checked the records in the city and just to see how long this program has been around, and I have found online records that go back to 1999. And in that year, approximately 55 organizations applied for funding, and I recognize lots of the names that were applying for funding way back when, so a lot of those organizations are still with us. But this really is our longest running program. And this is one of the grants that we consistently offer to nonprofit arts and cultural organizations. This grant is not for individuals or small businesses or neighborhood associations or social service agencies, but really specifically for organizations that have in their mission arts and culture. And there are very, very few exceptions to that. And we'll talk about the condition that would be the exception in a little bit. This program is run on a 3-year cycle, which means that you apply now, and then if you're recommended for funding, you're not going to have to apply again in years 2 or 3. And you'll receive years 2 and 3 funding based on your original funding formula. So this, of course, the subsequent funding is conditional on our continued funding of the program by the city and county. So based on us receiving funding for the program, we can then continue to grant it out. So it is a continuous program, but we always have to add that caveat is that we don't do multi-year funding, but our office is funded on an annual basis. And it's also conditional on the reporting that we receive from you. So if there is a midterm report or a final report for each year, we need to make sure that we've got that report in, that you're in good standing, and then we can move on to the subsequent years of funding. The other thing is that this is our city-county partnership. So thanks to the generous support from the county, this grant is not a city-specific grant. So it is one of the few grants that we offer that really is open to the entire county. So if you're any qualified organization located in and providing program for Sacramento County, you're eligible for this program. And finally, this is for general operating support. So we're not asking you to create a new program. We really want to pay you for the work that you're already doing, that you've been doing through the new grant year. So if you're funded, you'll have to document your expenses, but your expenses are your staff, your office space, rent, your artist fees. So anything that you would normally be doing in your general operations. So no new programming is required. Next slide, please. Okay, eligibility, and I'm going to spend a little time on this. It's one of the most important slides. And forgive me if it seems like I'm telling you, you can't be this, you can't do this. So it seems like there are a lot of qualifiers. So for every qualifier, please remember that there are going to be other grant opportunities. So we want to really keep this grant opportunity open for nonprofit arts organizations, but there are going to be other grant opportunities this year that a number of different types of organizations will be qualified to apply for. So just remember that more things are coming up down the road, and they'll be coming, pretty soon. So keep your eye out for other opportunities. But this one is specifically, first and foremost, you must be a nonprofit organization. So you can't have a fiscal sponsor. I know a couple of people have called and asked about that, but again, we'll have opportunities for organizations with fiscal sponsorship. So this one is for someone who has their nonprofit status. And you can't be in the process of getting your nonprofit status. You already have to have nonprofit 501c3 status. And we're going to ask you in the application, as you'll see, for you to upload your letter of determination from the IRS. So without that, we can't qualify you for eligibility. We're also going to, and this is a new requirement, we're going to need to confirm that you're in good standing with the California Secretary of State. And that will mean that you're up to date on any paperwork and filing that's necessary. So if you think your status might have lapsed or you're just not sure, there are a couple of easy ways to check. And I've got a couple of websites that I will add to the slides. I don't have them in here now, but they're really easy ways that you can check that your organization is in good standing. One of them is called the Registry of Charitable Trusts, and it's a California website. And you would just put in your legal name into the website, and it would pull up your nonprofit status, and it would tell you if you were current with all of your paperwork. That's one thing that the city is really going to check before we go into any contracts. So we're going to take a look at it when we go through the eligibility process for applicants, just to make sure that that's happening. Sometimes, I mean, we've had organizations who have been behind on something, or their information hadn't all gotten into the system, and within a matter of days, they were able to clear it up really quickly. So if you see something that says your status is, not up to date, don't panic, just go through the process, and you can usually clean that up pretty quickly. You must be an arts cultural and art service organization to apply. So I'm going to give you an example. If your organization, for example, provides mental health support services to Sacramento County, and that includes a weekly art therapy program, unfortunately, that does not make you eligible under these guidelines. Neither would a high school theater program that was part of a regular high school's programming. These are all great programs, and they may qualify for other grants, but it's just not qualified under this application. So again, arts and culture and nonprofit status, the two important things you need to pay attention to. We do have one exception, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky. If you're an educational institution, and primarily of higher education, that has a special public-facing entity with its own budget, audience, and mission. So I'm going to give you one example, and it's certainly not the only example, but the Sacramento Shakespeare Festival, which provides a public arts festival, performing arts festival every year. It's run out of Sacramento City College, but it has its own budget, it has its own programming, it's open to the public, it is for the public. That organization would be applicable, but only the portion of the application's budget which is for the arts and culture programming. So you look at the whole entire, Sacramento City College budget and put that in as your budget. We're going to really look at only the programming and only the budget that is appropriate to that particular program. We do ask for a 3-year history of programs, but something new in this application this year, you don't need 3-year of nonprofit status. So as long as you have current nonprofit status and you've been doing programming for 3 years, that's going to make you eligible. So that's sort of a new addition that we put in here, and hopefully that makes things easier for people. In the past, organizations have, had their nonprofit status for 2.5 years and they were ineligible, and we really didn't want that to happen. So your programming, obviously, and your physical location must be in the county. So when we ask in the application for your address, you can't just provide us with a PO box. We're going to really need to see your legal address for the organization. And if for some reason, I can't think of any examples, but if you were an organization that was legally situated in Sacramento County, but you did all of your programming elsewhere, maybe across the state or across the country, and didn't do a significant amount of programming in Sacramento County, you would not be eligible. We ask that your budget size is at least $25,000, and that can be either in years 2019, 20, or 21. We're going to be really open to that because we know some organizations, their budget really shrunk after 2019. And again, we're not trying to exclude small organizations from applying for grants, because I think we're going to have opportunities that are going to be much better suited for smaller organizations. So we're asking that at least your budget is $25,000. And again, if you're an educational organization that has that programming arm, that programming budget would also have to meet the $25,000 minimum. And you have to be in compliance with all previous reports. So if you've had any grants with us or any grants with the city, regardless of the grant program, we're going to need to be sure that your reporting is in order, that we've received all the reports, that they've been approved. This also includes your data arts reports, and that's key to a number of our grantees who were in the last cycle. I've noticed that we've run a report, and maybe about half those organizations haven't completed, or at least haven't submitted their data arts reports for 2020. And we are going to need that data before you can move on. So we'll be able to check. If you're not sure, you can check with me or our office, and we can let you know. And then we would just ask you to go in there and run that 2020 report. So that's a lot about eligibility. And I know there's still going to be a lot of questions out there. And if there are any doubts in your mind whether you're eligible, I would so much rather have you call me or email me and ask me the question, and we could look through your organization and just determine that. Because what I don't want people to do is go through the whole application process and spend a lot of time and energy on this application and then find out they weren't eligible. And I've kind of done a peek into the system, and there are a couple of organizations that I'm just not quite sure about yet. And I might contact you if I feel like, we might need to answer a couple of questions before you move on. So again, unless you feel like you neatly fall into all of these categories, please check in with me and we'll look at it. So that's eligibility. So next slide. Okay, so what's different now? Obviously, we talked about eligibility, and so the requirements are different. So some of the eligibility requirements will be different now than maybe they have been in the past. So we want you to be aware of that. Minimum size of the organization, obviously we talked about that as well. So $25,000 and up. Good news, no match requirement. And that is really different from previous cycles. We've asked you to match, whether it's, a 1-to-1 match or a 2-to-1 match. In this case, everybody's had a really hard couple of years, and we didn't want to add another burden to your requirements. So this money, if you are eligible and approved for funding, you will not have to match it with other funds. So we're not adding to your burden. This is for general operations, not programs. So we want you to spend this money on what you normally do. Again, we hope that this helps you. You don't have to come up with specific new things that you're doing. Just, really spend the money on those most critical needs for your organization. The only exception to that rule would be is if you're an educational organization applying for your arts programming. If you're not going to be doing any arts programming in 2022, then we really have to talk about that in terms of eligibility, because that would be the only way that you would become eligible for this grant. And if you're just suspending programming for this next year, then that would be something that we'd have to talk about. Another thing which I hope is good news is the minimum size of the grant this year will be $5,000. So no organization who is approved and recommended for funding would receive a grant less than $5,000. In the past, I know we've given as little as $1,000, and obviously it's work and time and resources that go into doing a grant application. So rather than to make you go through all that work for a little bit of money, we at least think $5,000 would be minimum. I can't tell you the maximum size of the award, however, because that will be determined based on how many people apply and are approved for funding. I can tell you that the grant pool is much bigger than it was in previous cycles. I think the last cycle it was $450,000 for the entire program. And this year we are at approximately $925,000. So it's almost twice the size. But again, until we know how many grant applicants we have, then it's going to be difficult to talk about your maximum award. But again, you're not applying for a particular amount, and that may be different in this application than in the past. You're just submitting your application, and everybody that's approved will be going through a formula process to determine the amount of the award for those grants. Excuse me. We do have a new grant system. So if you've only ever received CAA funding from us in the past, you're probably familiar with our old platform, which was web grants. And now we're using something called GoSmart. I think it's a pretty accessible platform, probably easier than web grants, and has great customer support. And if you have applied for CARES or Creative Economy or Cultural Equity grants with us in the last couple of years, you're probably familiar with GoSmart. You probably use that platform for your applications. So, and we have instructions on the website about how to start using GoSmart. An important thing this year is we're using something called a new funding rubric, which is actually a scoring guide that was designed to help our panelists score consistently based only on areas they're asked to review. We've gotten feedback in the past from panelists saying, I may be using one way to determine who should be funded or what the success of the application is, while the person next to me is looking at it in a totally different way. And we really want to level the playing field and make sure that everybody is looking at your applications all in the same manner and based on things that we think are really important. So we've created the funding rubric. It's part of the guidelines. And they're going to be looking at 4 areas that we feel best represent what we're looking for in these applications. So we'll be discussing the rubric in detail in a few minutes, but I just want to make sure that you really do take some time when you're going through the guidelines before you even start the application to take a look at the rubric and really understand how the panelists are going to be looking at the application. And finally, and we'll be talking about this next, but we're going to have an additional opportunity for funding through ARPA dollars for many of our applicants. So if the funding is approved by the city to the Office of Arts and Culture, then city-based organizations may be eligible to receive additional ARPA dollars without submitting an entirely new application. So next slide, and let's talk about that. So what is ARPA supplementary funding? ARPA funding's the federally funded American Rescue Plan Act support that was granted to the city of Sacramento for eligible projects and subgranting. So the city adopted a framework for its funding priorities, and the arts and the creative economy were prioritized to receive $10 million total in support. So the Office of Arts and Culture has recommended that a portion of these funds go to our arts and cultural nonprofits. So in order to streamline the process for organizations, we've requested that this grant application can also serve as the basis for an application for ARPA funding. At present, this only applies to city-based organizations because these are city ARPA dollars they would have to be spent on city organizations. Now, that said, if the county determines that it wants to use a portion of its ARPA allocation to support nonprofit arts organizations, and if they've determined that this is the best vehicle, as we have, then we may be able to include county organizations in this additional grant funding. And just a note that ARPA has its own federal guidelines for reporting and eligibility. So you may need to provide additional documentation. So not everyone may meet the requirements to qualify, but the important thing is you won't have to go through another whole long application. What we would probably do is just ask you for additional application that met the ARPA guidelines. So it's mostly done to make everything easier for you and not make you go through a whole nother process. But we do think that there's really a good opportunity for additional funding, which is another reason that if you qualify for this particular program, we really want you to apply. And the reason that it's done in two parts and we're not making it one neat, clean package is it because we're still going through the process within the city with the city's auditors and the people who are in charge of the ARPA dollars, just to make sure that everything that we're doing qualifies. But in the meantime, we really knew we needed to get this program out to the community. So it would have been wonderful if we could have done it all together, but we think it's most important to get you the dollars out now, and probably within the next few weeks as we're going through the application process, we'll know more about what we need to add and the questions that we'll need to ask you at a later date. So all will be revealed pretty soon. So, okay, next slide. So I mentioned the scoring rubric, and I did want to spend some time on this because I think it's really key to the application. The questions that are in the application are structured to relate to each category of the rubric, and the amount of points you can generate for your application is based on whether your answers minimally meet requirements, they adequately or successfully meet expectations, or they exceed expectations for that category. And there are numbers of points that are given for each in that area. One point that I really want to make clear to everybody is that we don't expect your organization will exceed expectations in all categories. This is not what this rubric is about. It's about offering you an opportunity to talk about what you're doing really well in, what you're maybe working on, what you know you want to improve, or the changes you want to make in your organization, and also to say something absolutely just doesn't apply to you. And there'll be many cases that you'll see as we go through this that the situation just doesn't apply, and that's perfectly okay. I think there's an opportunity for every organization to shine in some areas. So I really want to emphasize, focus on the things that you do well and tell your story. The rubric is composed of 4 main categories that, again, we've determined are most important as we look at applications in this category. Number 1, diversity and equity, which will be 20% of the application. Artistic impact, 30%. Community impact, also 30%. And organizational accountability, 20%. So they're not exactly evenly weighted, but they're all very important, and there are areas that you can all address. And as we go through the applications, you'll see how that works. Next slide. So the first one, diversity and equity. You'll see that in each of the 4 categories that we're going to talk about, there are always going to be 2 main areas that we're going to ask you to address. And then there'll be a number of indicators that demonstrate what your capacity is in these areas. So under diversity and equity, it says shows a commitment to a diverse board and staff, and programs and projects that prioritize racial equity and cultural diversity. And you can show these by some of the indicators, such as percentage of your board or staff that identify as BIPOC or LGBTQ+, or identify as another marginalized community. And, really, obviously think about how you view marginalized communities. We could have listed a whole laundry list and really missed some marginalized communities. So we really want you to think about who you're addressing. They could include incarcerated individuals, veterans could be considered a marginalized community. It could be youth in the juvenile justice system, a group that you can demonstrate as marginalized. So for example, shows a commitment to a diverse staff and board. You may look at this and say, and I've talked to a couple of people, but we have a really small staff. We have a staff of 1 or 2 people. So how are we going to show diversity? Well, you might have a larger board that is diverse. So it's an opportunity to look at your staff and your board separately and talk about, where you sit with each one of these entities. The second area asks about whether you pursue programs and projects that prioritize racial equity and cultural diversity. And we're looking both internally, so within your organization, and in terms of the programs you do externally. So you would have an opportunity to talk about any leadership initiatives that you're doing to support a diverse staff. Maybe programs that center diverse experiences, or the presentation of work by diverse artists. So those are all areas that you could really demonstrate in that area. Next slide. Artistic impact. So here we're looking at whether you're producing artistically significant work. And I really want you to think about how you define artistically significant. We're not going to give you parameters for what we think is artistically significant. Your job is to make the case for your artistic significance. And also, are you supporting and engaging a qualified workforce? So questions could be, who are the artists you're working with? Are you supporting local artists? Are you bringing new voices to the region? Are you creating new work, or are you preserving a cultural heritage? Are you paying artists and other workers and providing benefits or some kind of professional development? So you can see in this category, there's a broad range to how you can answer these questions. So for example, an all-volunteer theater group is going to have a very different set of answers than an equity company in terms of how artists are paid. But the goal for you is to lean into your strengths in these areas. So there's just not one way for an organization to demonstrate artistic impact. And when you look at the questions, you'll see there are just many different roads you could take and opportunities to offer examples in those areas. And I'm going to run through the rubric, and then I might stop and look at some of the Q&A and see if there are any questions we want to answer. So next slide is community impact. So the 2 areas of focus are contributes to economic and community well-being and shows community investment in program. And some indicators would be engaging in partnerships with the community or local businesses and agencies, working in historically disinvested communities, excuse me, showing strong community investment or volunteer engagement with work. And I want to emphasize, please, when you're discussing community, we ask you to be as specific as possible. So I just want to say now, community doesn't just mean everybody in Sacramento County, they're part of my community. We really want you to think about the neighborhoods where your programs take place, the demographics of your audience or members, the way your audience identifies itself, and what's unique about it. All right, so here's an example. I'm going to go back to a theater company again. So you're a theater company and you immediately think that your audience is everybody in the greater Sacramento area is my community because our work is for everybody. So I'm going to challenge you a little bit to go deeper, because I'll bet that you have some programs that really aren't for everybody. Do you have something that's specifically for school children? Do you have something for seniors in assisted living? Are you doing work in juvenile justice system? Are you producing work with themes that resonate for a particular audience? And are you working to engage that audience? So please think about that when you're thinking about community, because I'm sure that everybody can go deeper, and that's really what we're going to be looking for. And last slide in rubric is, excuse me, organizational accountability. And in some ways, this may seem like the most straightforward because it's really talking about governance and finances. But I think we've thrown in a little jargon that we did try to unpack, but I want to make sure that it's clear to you. So our two areas to explore here are demonstrates good governance and planning and demonstrates sound financial management, marketing, and communications. So a simple way to demonstrate this is through board activity. Is your board active and engaged? Other good indicators are planning. And that doesn't mean that we need you to create a long-range plan that's 20 pages that you have to attach. We want to know, are you doing planning that's really based on what the situation is that you're going through now? So what planning have you done to respond to COVID-19? And when we talk about scenario planning, it's as simple as saying whether you thought of alternatives to situations and plan for them. So if we plan to do an exhibition in April and all of a sudden galleries are closed, can we make it an online virtual exhibition? Or have we thought of something else that we want to do? If our facility closes, what kind of programming have we thought about doing? So have we created plans based on alternative situations that we're dealing with? We also ask about the diversity of income sources and whether you have working capital, whether you have a marketing and communications plan, even a simple one. So that is the rubric. And you'll see again, as you enter the application, that the application does mirror the questions that we're asking here in the rubric. So as I try to regain my voice again, I'm going to start looking at some of the questions and answers and see if there's something that we can quickly answer here before we move on. Thank you for your patience. Okay. Our program is culturally based and incorporates the arts. We provide a 2-week summer performing arts camp for girls. Would we be eligible to support? Most of these questions about eligibility, I will ask that you, and I have the email at the end of this program, is that you contact me by email, because I think we really need to talk specifically with everybody. The way you've described it here, it's really, I don't have a lot of information. I would say probably not, but I would want to talk to you more about it. Does arts include music programs, youth orchestras? Absolutely. Let's see, program has, again, if it's about eligibility, let's talk offline about that. What if we've been a nonprofit as one name for over a year, but have operating history as another name over the previous 3? Yeah, that should probably be okay. Whenever there's a question about something being different, try to explain it when you get into your application. So if you're an organization and you've undergone a name change or something, there's an opportunity when you're talking a little bit about your mission or your history for you to add a little explanation. What you don't want panelists to do is say, I don't understand what's going on here. So whenever there's an opportunity to offer more explanation, that's great. Need last 3 years of programming or 3 years in a row prior to COVID? Bruce, that's a really good question. I think we'd have to talk about it. I think if you could demonstrate programming for those 3 years, if we know that the organization has continued to operate, I might be a little concerned, and maybe we should talk offline. If you haven't done programming in the last couple of years, for example, and maybe don't have any programming lined up for this year, we should discuss that. But if you're in operations and you're a nonprofit in good standing, what I don't want is for people just to put programming that's all been, way in the past. I think we want to be as recent as we possibly can, and also know that if things don't open up, what are your plans to be an active organization in some way rather than just in name only? But that's something we can talk about. If you're situated in and provide programming in Sacramento, but some clients are from out, yeah, that's perfectly fine. You can still serve your other program, we're a community here, and Yolo County is across the river, and, obviously we want to be as supportive of other communities and, individuals as possible. Fiscal sponsorship, what I mean by that is if you don't have your own nonprofit status, and if you do, you do, but oftentimes you can apply for some grants by affiliating yourself with a nonprofit. Often it's a service organization in your field that will use their nonprofit status. The grant money then goes to that organization, and they take a small percentage fee and they give you the grant. But that's not qualifying for this application. Are Latino Latinx under? Yeah, absolutely. And if it gets really confusing about what BAIPOC means, often you'll see BIPOC. We're trying to be consistent with the categories that the city is using, really to make sure that our city processes are all as consistent as possible. So that would be Black, Asian, Indigenous, people of color, and absolutely Latino, Latinx organizations are under that category. So I think I just explained, and DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I like to also include access, and there's an opportunity to talk about access as well. We are a California nonprofit. Do we need to have the US? Yes, it has to be a 501c3 with the federal government. And Sue, we could talk about that offline too. For the 18 application, we require just the budget from the data project. Most of the current data project is not relevant. Marie, maybe we can talk about that online, because I've gotten a couple up, and I know Data Arts has really, really recently changed its application. And I just received a Data Arts report, which was like 5 pages. It was super short and basic. So let's talk about that offline, because I think it may be simpler than you think. And if I'm wrong, I'm happy to discuss it, but it should, for our purposes, it's best to have the whole report. That's really how we can make, proper assessments of organizations over time. Do all groups need? Don't worry, if you're new to the program, don't worry about the Data Arts report. You will be required to do it as part of your reporting requirements moving forward, but not backwards. So don't worry about it if you're new to the program. But you're small. All right. So another organization says we're smaller than 15,000. Do you have recommendations? No, again, as we said, no fiscal sponsors for this program. But stay tuned, because absolutely we're going to have an opportunity for you very, very soon that's really suited for an organization of a smaller budget size. No new programming is required. You can certainly talk about your programming, and there'll be opportunities to talk about it. But when you dive into the application, we're not asking you for a project. We're just asking you to tell us about your organization and what you're doing. How long will it take for grant money to be awarded? Oh, that's a really good question. We're a city government agency, and there are so many steps in the process. So we've kind of done a little, timeline based on when the applications due. And some of you will be surprised, and some of you will not be surprised to learn that we really don't expect the funds to be in your account until April. That would be our best guess right now. Is low income considered marginalized? Absolutely. Talk about it specifically. Talk about what that community is. So when you'll see the application, if you're checking a box for marginalized communities, then there's an opportunity to talk about who that community really is. And for the funding report, what's the name of the grant program? Yeah, that's a good question. Again, don't worry about it. If you don't have a current grant with us, don't worry about it yet, but it's called the 2022-24 Cultural Arts Award Program. So that's what you'd be worrying. If you're going back and finishing your previous report, it's Cultural Arts Awards 2020. So that's great. Thank you for those questions. And we're going to just move on to the next slide. How to apply. You use, as I said before, you're going to use the GoSmart platform. So the first thing that you need to do if you're new to GoSmart is to make sure that you go in and you register. And please, please, please register as an organization. If you register as an individual, you're going to get a little email that's going to come right back to you that's going to say you are not eligible to apply for this program. We only can take organizations. So you're applying on behalf of an organization. So if you're new, you're going to register. It's going to take you through the registration process with a username and a password, and then it will take you to the application. So again, returning applicants, you've already got login information that you've had from past applications. We ask that you try to use the same login information, even if it's a new person handling the grant applications for your organization. It gets confusing in the system if there are multiple registrations for the same organization. So if you're struggling to figure out, well, I don't know my password anymore, it's been too long, or the person's left and took all the information, get in touch with us and we'll make sure that you can get that working. And so that's one profile for each organization that registers. So once you get in there, it'll take you right to the application and to the questions, which are, we'll go through that when we go through the application. So next slide. So my application tips, they're really simple. I think they're also in the guidelines, but answer every question as thoroughly as possible. We really are not looking for brilliant writing. We're just looking for complete answers. I would say people usually, if you're going to err on the side, maybe tell us too much rather than too little. When it becomes difficult to evaluate an application is when you're just not telling us enough about your organization and the work that you do. You've answered questions like just too simply. And again, it's really not about your prose or it's just your ability to tell your story in the best way that you know how. If bullet points are your thing, we're happy to take bullet points. So if you just want to bullet point a whole bunch of information and it tells your story that you think it tells you all the information that we need, do it that way. I mean, really do it the best way you can. If something doesn't apply to you, and I would be surprised if there was anybody here that at least one question didn't apply, right, not applicable. There's a little red dot next to everything that needs to be answered. And if you don't answer every question, it's not going to accept your submission. So you can write not applicable. But if it requires a little bit of explanation, feel free to, write something in there. Like if you look through the whole list and think, well, none of these apply, feel free to write a sentence or two about why they don't apply to your particular organization. But again, we're trying to make this as simple as possible for you. So we don't want you to spend a lot of time writing answers to things that just aren't relevant to you. I would say use as many words as are needed to tell your story. We have a character count or a word count, but it's really generous. The only reason that we have it in there at all is because the application sort of forces us to have some kind of limitations, but it's plenty big enough. But if you're like me, I tend to think that like I have to use every last character. That's just one of my weird quirks, and it's really not necessary. Don't feel like you need to do that. If you feel like you've told your story and you still got half the characters left, feel free to just leave it at that. I think we've asked enough questions to get to the heart of what you do. Some questions may require more words than others, but make sure that you've told your story, that somebody who's not familiar with your application will understand what you're doing. If you can complete it in 1,000 characters and the count is 2,500, don't worry about that. It's totally up to you. Just make sure you're answering your question. If you don't understand the question, we're going to ask you, I really recommend that you reach out. Don't try to answer something if you're really not sure what we're getting at in the question, and that's totally possible. I encourage you to reach out to our mentor, and we'll talk about how to contact that person. Allison is really the person that I would love for you to reach out to if you're looking at the application and you're really struggling with a question. She can really talk to you about how to work yourself through that process. I love for you to use examples whenever possible. An example, I think, is just worth like 1,000 words. Sometimes we tend to go into jargon or use really vague language when we're talking about programs, or you're thinking about the 50 other grant applications you wrote before and you just want to cut and paste something. Just give us like one good example about how you've done something that's really gonna, make a panelist sort of sit up and take notice and pay attention. Same thing with work samples. They're really important. Make them good. Often a work sample is the thing we think about last when we're down to the wire and we need to like attach 2 or 3 things to our application. And it's so important. For the most part, these panelists are not going to be familiar with your work. They're going to be experts in their field and experts in their subject matter and real peers in the field. But they're not going to be people who know you or know your organization. So you want to put your best foot forward. And, I encourage you to come to our work sample or media sample workshop that we're having next Tuesday. It'll give you some good ideas about what to do or what not to do. But I just encourage you to pay attention to them. And this is not about spending a lot of money or hiring anybody to do a work sample for you. It's just really maybe using what you've got and making sure that you use it to best advantage. And also ask somebody to read your application before submitting. And I even encourage you to ask somebody not in your organization, but somebody who has nothing to do with it, just so they understand it. Because as I said, if somebody doesn't know you or know your work, they're going to get their impression from you based on the application. So that's why I encourage you, just have somebody review it afterwards, just to make sure that it's making sense. There's just always a great likelihood that somebody's going to say, but gee, I didn't really understand what you meant by this answer here. And you can help to explain it a little bit more deeply. But it's just nice to have another eye on the application. So next slide. All right, and we're going to go to the next slide after that. So support materials, there are a couple of attachments to the grant application. I talked before about the proof of nonprofit status, so that's your IRS letter. And if people are really still unfamiliar with what that is, we can put a sample up on our website so that you can see what it should look like. If you have that letter, then it's a good indication that you are a current nonprofit organization. We're going to ask for financial statements, both from 2019 and 2020. Obviously, we're going to base your grant and the size of your grant on the year where your budget was largest. We know that 2020, everybody took a big hit. That's why we're asking for 2019 and 20. If your budget's over than $1 million, we're going to ask for an audited financial statement. Under $1 million, they don't need to be audited. We would request that they be signed by a board president or a board treasurer or someone on your board, so that we know that these really are your official financial statements, but really just your, income and expense statements. There is a location form. We want to know where you're doing programming. And that's really important to us for a couple of reasons. Obviously, we want to be sure that you qualify. So the location form will tell us what your programming history is for the last few years. But it's also really important for other reasons. It helps our office demonstrate to the county and the city officials the amount of work that's taking place and where it's happening and the difference you're making in your community. So please fill it out carefully. If you do 50 programs a season and you're overwhelmed just give us at least, a good sampling of what you do. I absolutely, if you feel overwhelmed by having to write down every single thing you do and every single thing space you have, don't feel like you need to do that. But we just want to make sure that it's complete. We're going to be looking for complete addresses of where your location is. Media work samples, obviously videos or images. If you are a performing arts organization specifically, I'm going to ask that you do submit of some kind of video of the performing arts. That images really aren't the best way to show your performing arts organization, but it's really up to you to figure out what samples you want. And the only other attachment is like maybe a page or two where you just have bios of your key artistic and technical staff, just so that we know who's participating in your organization, what their qualifications are. And that's it. So the last slide that we have here, if you need more support, there are a lot of ways to get it. We still have some time before the application is due. So if you have any questions that are really kind of simple eligibility questions or questions that could be answered pretty easily, please write your questions to Art Grants at City of Sacramento. We usually respond to them within a day. We're usually really quick about responding. If you want to schedule a mentor session, I didn't have this information when we did these slides, but go to our website under Apply for the Grant, and right underneath where all the workshops are listed, where you registered for the workshop, there is now a link to schedule an appointment with a mentor. And I would just encourage you to do that as soon as possible. If for any reason all these appointments get filled up really quickly and we don't have more, we'll make sure that we get somebody that can get back to you as soon as possible. We want to make sure you have support when you need it. Next week, we're doing a media samples webinar on January 11th at 4 p.m. We have Joya Fonda and Dominic Doda, both who are going to talk about images and visual arts and performing arts and video. You won't have to listen to me talk for an hour or so. It's going to be more informal. We're going to have people actually talking about good samples, bad samples. If you want to be a guinea pig and send me a sample in the meantime that you would like them to sort of pre-review, feel free to do that. We'll be really happy. Any kind of samples that we could use will help us demonstrate what we think good and bad samples are looking like. We're also going to have a Q&A session on January 12th, and that's totally informal. It's going to be at 5:30. So for those who couldn't come during the daytime, and you're really digging into the application and you just want to sit around and just ask questions, we'll make it open and as engaging as possible. And you can register for all of them. We ask you register in advance on our website, and the link is there on our arts website, our page website. So I am going to take one more look at the Q&As here, and then we're going to go to the application. How many video samples will you accept? Take a look at the application. We usually ask for one video sample because remember that it's a panel that's got to review, perhaps 80 plus applications. So, and we usually ask them to watch about 5 minutes of video. So we can't really have them looking at numerous videos and picking and choosing among them. So I'd really appreciate for you to do one video sample. And again, we ask them to watch about 5 minutes of it. We can talk about this at the media workshop, but cue it up to exactly where you want them to watch from, because when we say 5 minutes, if you don't tell us where to begin and where to end, they're going to start at the very beginning. And the last thing you want them to do is, perhaps spend the first 3 minutes watching people walk into a performance hall before anything begins. So be really careful. We'll talk about more about that next week. But the limitations really are size limitations, and it's all in the application. So you have X number of megabytes depending on the sample, and above that, we can't accept it. And obviously you can put links to YouTube videos and things like that. Okay, so let's see. Will grants be based on the organization's budget size? There's going to be a formula that's going to include different things. So budget size certainly will be a factor, but also the score that you get on the application is going to be a factor. We want to make sure that there is a balance, because we know organizations of many different sizes will be applying. So we want to make sure that there is, we want that all boats will rise, so to speak. We want to make sure that the smaller organizations get a significant amount of funding that's meaningful to them, while the larger organizations also get something that's meaningful again, but really needs to be a good balance. So we'll know more about the formula then, but please know that we're really conscious of making sure that this grant is meaningful. I came in late. Can a 501c6 apply or 501c3s only? But again, Jenna, if you want to send me an email offline and explain your situation, we did talk about educational organizations, and there may be a couple of exceptions to that rule, but it's primarily for 501c3s. So I think that is everything we have there. And I am going to now try, hopefully, to share the actual application, if it's still working. Okay. It says that I'm sharing, but I don't think I am. Diana, is that sharing?
Yes, we see your application.
Okay. So this is what the application is going to look like when you get into it. And I haven't, this is what it looks like when you actually get into it. There'll be a step before you get to the applicant profile, and it will just be you're putting in like some very basic information, like what your legal name is. I think it asks you for your nonprofit number. And then there's a little button that's going to say submit. And that's, you submit that, and then it will bring you to these pages. And you'll notice here on these pages, there are lots of opportunities to save your work. So know that the very first piece you do, it'll say submit, and you might be nervous because you're thinking, I'm not ready to submit my application, but that's just submitting your qualifications to get into the application. So really, basically, it begins with the applicant profile. You know, obviously legal name of the organization, address. Please, please, please fill out everything as detailed as possible, because we really need to know how to reach you. And I can't tell you how many applications we get that don't include addresses, only include emails. We need every bit of this. And if we don't get it, in this case, you won't be able to submit because it's got all these little red dot next to everything that you need in order to submit, but we would send it back to you because we need to know everything. There's a question about city council district where the organization's located. For those of you in the city, you know that your council district might have changed in the last couple of days. I just found out I'm no longer District 5, I'm District 7. So there is a council district locator. So if you don't know whether or not your council district, particularly for your work location, has changed, I would encourage you to check that before you just write in what you think your council district is. And obviously we're going to ask you for also the name of your county supervisor, and there's a little box here that helps you figure that out. Sort of whether you're a new applicant, if you've submitted your data arts funding report. And again, it says right here, 2020 reports must be completed before funding is awarded. So it gives you a little bit of extra time if you haven't done your data arts report. I know there's a lot on your plate. This is a really hard time, and we're really trying to balance getting good information from everybody and creating a level playing field, but not overburdening people. And that's an awfully hard balance to have. So that said, you'll have a little bit of extra time. I'm not going to turn away your application if your data report doesn't come in for a couple of weeks afterwards, just know that we do need it, and it's just part of the reporting requirements, and we're going to ask for that at some point in time before you're able to get your award. Again, contact information, be as clear and as thorough as possible. We want to make sure that we've got the best information, because it's all going to go into a spreadsheet and we're going to use it for a long time. Financial information, here's the first thing you upload is your proof of nonprofit status. So that's where you're going to upload it. We ask you for your operating income for 2 years, and you'll also be uploading your financial statement. And there are different places for audited financial statements and regular financial statements. And that's sort of the very first basic information. Organizational information, pretty straightforward. Your mission, your purpose, your core programs, and your target audience or constituency. Be really clear about this, because there are going to be a lot of questions later that are going to refer back to who you said your core audience is. And here we're asking you to upload a copy of your board list. So that was also needed. And then, as we said, which goes back to the rubric, the 4 categories, and each section is based on one of those categories. So the first one is diversity, equity, inclusion, and you'll see we've added accessibility. And for those who just need more information about how we look at these, there's a little explanatory information there about what qualifies for that. So we're going to ask what percentage of your staff and your board identify in any of these categories. Again, there's always a category for any other marginalized community. So rather than giving you a huge list, we're giving you an opportunity to talk more about that. Same thing with your board. So talk about that. And then your core audience. So talk about if any of your core audiences fit these categories, and if so, how and why. How DEIA is prioritized throughout your organization. So that can be internal prioritization. So you can talk about any initiatives you have within your organization. So perhaps as an organization and as a staff, we're going through a learning process about, diversity, and perhaps we're doing some reading, or we're attending workshops, or we're taking a class or something. There's an opportunity to talk about what you're doing internally, and internal practices and planning. Perhaps you've got a leadership initiative where you're looking at creating leadership among different communities and how you're prioritizing that. So again, there are opportunities to talk about it both internally and externally. What programs are we doing that really prioritize DEIA? So that'll be that section. Artistic impact. Here is an opportunity to upload bios. We're going to ask for bios of your key artistic, technical, and leadership staff. Please don't attach resumes or CVs. These are just really short little paragraph bios that we would say no more than 2 pages, just so that we have a sense of who the artists are in your organization. That's important to us. Do you offer your staff, volunteers, or cultural workers any of the following? So learning opportunities, internal and external professional development. So an internal learning opportunity could be, we're bringing in someone to work with the staff on, particular skill building. An external professional development could be, do we send you to industry conferences, or do we offer you opportunities to attend other meetings? Obviously, health benefits and 401k retirement plans. Clearly, it doesn't apply to everybody, but we want to know if you are doing it. It's important to our process. And then again, give us an example. And this is where I say, rather than you telling us everything, just give us a couple of really good examples of what you're doing. Workforce composition. What's your approach to compensation? We haven't asked that question a lot, and I think it's an important thing to learn about our field locally, and it's an important thing for us to address. Are you paying staff? Are you paying artists? And what's your pay scale? And we clearly don't expect everybody to have the same priorities or the same opportunities. an all volunteer organization is going to be really different than, you know, an equity company, for example. So we understand pay scales are different, but we want you to be able to discuss your compensation plans. And we also want to know full-time staff, part-time staff, volunteers, interns, youth, contracted personnel. So again, it gives us an opportunity to see, you know, how many people work with you and under what conditions and circumstances. And I believe we've asked for this information to the year prior to the pandemic. So, you know, we're sort of looking at your staff as it is, you know, normally, as opposed to during kind of extraordinary times where perhaps you've had to lay people off. And then we talk about artistic goals. And you'll see every category that is a little bit larger, that's the sort of the bucket under which things fall, the questions fall. So the first category is support of local creative artistic community. And there'll be a number of questions that really talk about how you may demonstrate your commitment to local artists and local community. That might not be what you do. Your role may be bringing only international artists to Sacramento. If that's the case, totally feel free to write non-applicable or zero. And you might just want to say, and I think in one of these blocks, that this doesn't apply to us because we work with international artists, because there's going to be a place for you to talk about that. So the next big bucket is connection to a regional, national, or international community and questions that relate to that. So if your work is really about employing and supporting local artists, then you might not have anything to say in this category. And then there's one about sharing or preserving cultural heritage, which is key to a lot of our organizations here in Sacramento. Not everybody, but it's an opportunity to really talk about how you're approaching a cultural heritage. Are you pushing the boundaries of it? Are you really embracing it and bringing in, you know, masters in the field to work with your artists? I mean, there may be so many different ways you're looking at cultural heritage, and this is an opportunity to really talk about those ways in greater detail. So those are sort of the big buckets around artistic impact, community impact. Again, we talk about your typical audience size range and type of events. So if you offer some smaller, more intimate events, just, you know, in a few words, just describe, you know, we do, you know, studio performances and the audience size is 20 to 30. And then we may also do, you know, full scale performances in a larger house and the audiences, you know, 200 to 300, whatever that might be. But as long as it relates to you, we ask if you have plans to grow or diversify your audience and describe what those activities are. And we've really given you a couple of examples, and they're not exclusive to any other examples. It just might help you think about what those things might be. We look at community impact. So have you had an economic impact on your neighborhoods? Do you serve or are embedded in historically disenfranchised communities? Do you serve youth in underinvested neighborhoods, or maybe you do none of the above? If you do any of these, we'll just ask you to explain and give a couple of examples of those. Community investment. So this is an opportunity to talk about if community members volunteer with your organization. Do they financially support your work? Do they partner with you in your work? And provide examples. Again, you don't necessarily have to fit in all of these categories. And this is another one. Do you partner with organizations that focus on any of the followings? And then we talked about some other areas that you may work with organizations that work in health and wellness, with organizations that work in immigration. There are organizations that work with incarcerated individuals, work on environmental issues, agriculture, food. You may do a number of those things, and hopefully this will kind of spark ideas that you have been doing certain things that you can talk about. And community representation. So is your staff and board representative of the communities that you serve? So when you've talked about who you serve and how you serve them, we're going to ask to look at, let's to do some internal work and look at your board and staff and see how they reflect the communities you serve. And organizational accountability, really quickly. We talk about planning. And again, a lot of it talks about COVID response, just because we want to start collecting some information about the field and how it has responded to COVID. This will really help us serve you better as we move down the line. So has your programming changed? Have your priorities changed? Is the way that you raise money different than it was before? Do you have different resources that you didn't have access to before? An opportunity to talk about that. Talk about changes that you're making perhaps to a changing environment. So this is a little bit different. So if you haven't applied for this program since 2018, maybe things in the world have changed. What would be an example? Say you're an organization that has had a subscription base for years and years and years, and you're realizing that the number of subscriptions have gone down, they've declined over the years because people don't want to engage in that way anymore. Are you starting to do things that really address those changes in audiences? I think we realize that a lot has changed in our community, and we just want to look at how organizations are responding to changing demographics, changing ages of members or constituents, changing behaviors. And have you really thought about that? And are you being responsive to that? How is your annual budget developed? Who's reviewing your budgets? Who's talking about it? Do you have a committee of volunteers? Is it just staff oriented? And board involvement. Lots of questions about, does your board give? Does your board volunteer time? Does your board engage with your organization in any other way? And questions about financial planning. We do talk a little bit about working capital, and do you have operating reserves? Don't be freaked out by that. You might look at that question and say, oh my God, how can you expect us to have operating reserves right now? But it's really important for us to know, because how can we plan for the field if we don't know how many months of working capital the average organization has? And sometimes the thought is, well, small organizations won't have working capital, but large ones will. Sometimes it's just the opposite. Sometimes they're very small organizations do have some working capital. So we don't want to make any assumptions about that, and we want to learn what it is you do. Support material, here's where you're going to upload everything. It's pretty simple and self-explanatory. If you have images or JPEGs, you're going to attach them here. If you have a video, you're going to attach it here. And we do ask that at least you attach a document telling us what we're going to be looking at or seeing. So it would be kind of a work sample list. But perhaps you're an organization which deals with the written word, and you want to show us an example of, poetry or writing, and you do want to include a document. That's where you would put it. Again, these are all attachments, and they all have size limitations, but that's really it. And all the instructions are there. And then when you're done, you're going to hit submit. And as you notice here, I didn't answer any of these questions. So it's not going to let me submit because I have all these required questions. Once I've answered every single question and none of these boxes is empty, there's going to be the opportunity for me to submit. Don't submit until you're done and ready, because you can't go back into your application once you press submit. So I ask you to, wait, make sure you've read it clearly, make sure you've downloaded a PDF so you have a copy of for your files. There's an opportunity, I believe it's up at the top of the application at any time, to download a PDF. So you have that available to you. Save as you go along. It gives you so many opportunities throughout, and there are those big save buttons. So just keep pressing them as you're doing your application. And that's it. And I am going to hopefully stop my screen share. And I have talked way too much, so let's see if there are any, let's see if there's any hands raised. Let's see if I can do that. If people want to ask some questions. Oops. There are a couple of hands raised, and the first one is Miranda. If you still have a question, I'm sorry, you might have raised it a long time ago. You can unmute yourself and ask. No, I think you put your hand raised down. Patty, do you have a question? And if anybody else has a question that they just want to ask, I'll still go into the Q&A and answer any questions there. But if you just want to shoot out a question, you can unmute yourself, I believe, and ask the question. And anybody else that feels like they need to run, that they've heard everything they need to hear, please feel free to check out our next webinars and email us and set up an appointment for a mentor. And thanks for coming. But the rest of you that want to hang out and ask questions, please feel free to do so. We have a little bit of time. Patty.
I was wondering about the definition of the programming budget of 25,000 and over. So what does that mean? I'm not really sure I understand that.
That really only applies if you don't fall into the basic category, which is going to be 99% of our applicants of an arts and cultural organization. If you're an arts and cultural organization, then your budget is your budget. So don't worry about that.
Oh, okay. And so, but is your budget your income, right?
Yes, it goes by your income. Yes.
Okay, not your net profit.
Nope, it'll totally be based on your income.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Sure. Anybody else want to raise your hand and ask a question? Marie.
Oh, hello.
Hi there.
How are you?
I'm hoarse. Go ahead.
I can tell. I'm so sorry. You know, I hear you coughing back there. I hope it's nothing serious. But
no, it's just talking too much. It's just like.
So I have kind of two questions. In the workforce category, you ask if there's compensation comparable to industry standards. Can you define that more? And the other.
Thank you for asking. Let me take that part first and then ask me your second part. We've asked you we're putting it back onto you to define what you think industry standards are for you and where you are. So it could be, I hate to say I don't think that there are industry standards for the field in general, whether it's theater or, multidisciplinary. It's sort of where you are maybe in your budget size or where you are in your development. You're really going to talk about, these tend, so for example, if you feel like you are paying wages or fees that are comparable to other organizations your size or your type, you might want to mention that. You might just want to say these are the standards that we know that other organizations like ours are compensating their artists. We've talked to our artists about compensation, and this seems to be relevant. It's also perfectly okay to say, we wish we could pay, we feel like maybe we're not at industry standard wages. And for a number of reasons, we're not there. That's maybe what we're working towards, and we're going to hopefully get there. It's just really trying to get a sense that, are we looking at an entire community where artists aren't being compensated? So part of what we're trying to do is to take the temperature of the community. Where do we stand? Are there organizations that might be bigger budget organizations that when they really look at their compensation, it might be too low? So it's just an opportunity to really talk about it.
Great. Well, I think that my second question then kind of relates to that. I can understand and appreciate wanting to gather data from the field and understand what the lay of the land is. That's, I think, really important for the agency. But what gets confusing is when there are questions like the COVID related, because you want to understand how we're doing, what we're doing, how things are looking out there. When it's in a grant application, it takes greater weight. So how seriously are we going to be answering these questions? How much weight will panelists give them as questions included in a grant application versus questions as an agency you may be asking us for information for yourselves that
Yep. No, thank you. That's a really good question.
you.
We're going to work really closely with the grant panelists to go over the application and to go over the rubric. So you could have taken an enormous hit from COVID, and you can address that. You can also say, because of that, we've done other things, and that doesn't compensate for the enormous hit that we took, but we've tried to survive, and this is how we've tried to survive. We're trying to, it's very difficult because we're trying to look at you in terms of sort of the entire ecosystem. So we're trying to get a picture of you before COVID, which is why we're asking you a lot of information about what happened with your organization in 2019. Where were you? Where were you going? And you have the opportunity to continue to talk about that. But we can't also neglect that COVID took place, and we want to know sort of where you are now, because
Right. How does that get ranked? I mean, how does that get ranked by a panelist? If I were a panelist, I would say, ooh, well, how am I supposed to, give them a high mark or a low mark?
Your high mark is that you've thought about it. Your high mark is that you've addressed it. Your high mark is that you've taken steps. If you went into COVID and said, no, I'm going to do everything exactly the way we did it last year, and that's just it, that's something that a panelist is going to look at, because it's about being responsive. I guess that's sort of the easiest way to say it. And again, remember, there are so many opportunities, which is why I keep going back to, we've asked a lot of things in this application.
Yes, you have.
We're asking for a lot of stuff. I bet you're going to have fewer words than you did back in 2018. I honestly think in some ways it's going to be easier to write, but we're asking you a lot about your organizations in many different areas, and it's the whole package. So please.
Yes, this is worse than an NEA grant.
Nah,
Yes, it is.
Tell me that when you're done.
This one is really, I'm going like, what?
No, really, honestly, go through it, and if you get stuck,
I have several times. I started before the end of the year because it's so complicated, and I ain't a novice at this. So I just want to get it all clear, but
all
man,
right.
Melissa.
All right, thanks.
Really?
Thanks. Okay, so who do I have next? I don't have name. Let's see. Kathleen. Question?
I'm going to go kind of follow along with her train of thought. In order for our organization to survive, we invested in the CARES Act. We got PPP loans, which we've since had forgiven. We participated in a program that has nothing to do with arts education. We fed elderly and sick for over 7 months. So that's the kind of thing. Okay, so we can go ahead and include that, although it was not arts programming.
Absolutely. Look at the community section and you'll see there, that's a really good opportunity. And you are not alone there. I can guarantee you numerous organizations went out of their boundaries to meet needs, and the community section of the application, community impact, that's an opportunity for you. So think of it as an opportunity, okay?
But we should go ahead and mention that we did get PPP. We did apply for EIDL. We applied for different grants and loans that kept us going through 2020.
Absolutely. In your organizational section, there's an opportunity, and we're going to be looking at your budget. So I'm imagining that's all part of your budget.
Yes, it is. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So I don't see any other hands raised because I'm assuming that those hands raised are done. I'm going to just look at the Q&A again. All right, Anson, we're on a fiscal calendar. Does the 2020 financial document mean July 20? It means your fiscal 2020. So whatever that is. So that would be And I've been at this too long. It would be like 19 through 20. July 19 through 20, yeah. When will we be able to submit the application? You could submit it today if you were done. The due date, I believe, is the 21st of January. Please go back and look at the guidelines, because I'm saying this without the guidelines in front of me, but I believe that's the last day to submit the application. I encourage you, don't wait until the minute before midnight. If you're going to have any questions, we're going to leave the office at 5 o'clock that day. So get those questions into us before then, and obviously submit as early in that day as possible, just in case there are any glitches. I don't expect them, but once it closes, it closes. So give yourself a little bit of wiggle room to submit the application. Will be penalized if you don't have working capital? No. I don't know. You won't be penalized for anything. I hate to keep saying that, but this is really about everything. So there are going to be some organizations that are going to have certain areas, other organizations it's just not going to apply to them. This is about the wholeness of your organization, but we had to look at your wholeness of organization through different lenses. So there's the artistic lens and the community lens. That's always going to be important. Clearly in our office, the diversity, equity, and inclusion's really, as part of the city, going to be something that we are going to continue to raise up and to put forward. And we know that every organization can find ways to demonstrate the work that they're doing, or that the work that they intend to do. And we're just hoping that people make strides in all of these areas. And if it's stuff that you're already doing, then, you know, it's your opportunity to, again, your opportunity to shine and tell everybody what you're doing really well. How do we want to calculate operating budget versus gross revenue? Again, your operating budget is your revenue budget. It's just going to be how you report your financial statement. And if you have really specific questions that you want to run by us, give us a call. Our budget has grown and is larger for 2021 than 20. Can we use those numbers? If you have your 2021 financial statement completely done, then you can absolutely use those numbers. We were giving you that range of 2019 to 21. So is an opportunity to use your largest numbers possible. So yes. Let's see. If our organization was previously in Sacramento County but had to relocate to Yolo County due to COVID-19, I'm sorry to say no, you are no longer eligible to apply for the grant. If you are currently in Yolo County and that's your center of operations, no, you can't apply for the grant. The money is so specific to Sacramento County. We are being funded by both the county and the city, and they have very specific restrictions on where the money goes. And I know that there are probably a number of Yolo County based organizations that do programming in Sacramento, and they just can't apply for those. So sorry about that. I feel like, does anybody else?
Valerie has her hand up in the chat. I mean,
Okay, thank you, Valerie. Thank you. I just said that. Unmute yourself.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. We're also one of those organizations who've had to move our rehearsals around because we lost our rehearsal facility during COVID. We've done almost all of our rehearsing via Zoom. We've continued to operate. We haven't had as much community outreach as we usually do, but we've had some. We just represented Sacramento, in Hawaii for the Pearl Harbor celebration. But we have been rehearsing for a few times in West Sacramento. So our operations really are here in Sacramento. Our PO box is here, our bank is here, our officers are mainly here. We have some members who are in, adjoining counties, but the
Mhm.
majority of our members are Sacramento residents.
Mhm.
How do we demonstrate that we're still a Sacramento organization when we don't really have a physical site that's regular? We've had any physical rehearsals in the last 6 months have been done in West Sacramento
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, I'm not so worried about your rehearsals. You have a mailing address, which is a PO address.
Yes, here in Sacramento. Off
We
of
are going to
Alpharetta.
ask for a physical address.
Okay,
So that could, and if you absolutely have no physical address that is a physical office, then it should be the address of a board member or somebody that represents the organization. Again, that would have to be in Sacramento County. And
yes,
when you do your location report, if, and the location report can cover a 3-year period. So
Okay.
if you can demonstrate that some of your locations have been Sacramento County,
That's easy. We can do that.
yeah, it might throw up a flag if all I was looking at in your location was, West Sacramento,
one.
everything that was happening.
Yeah.
But
Most
obviously,
of the last 3
rehearsal
years.
space is an issue, and
Yeah.
everybody has that issue.
Yeah, and most of our rehearsal over the last 3 years took place here in Sacramento County. It's only been the last few months where we were looking for a place to meet when we thought we could, but we're back to Zoom again, so.
No, I know. As I was entering this workshop today, I just kept thinking, the news, every time you listen to it, even today, it gets a little bit more dire. So, yeah.
Well, we hope to be back here soon.
Yeah.
Thank you for answering my question. I appreciate it.
Sure. Any other questions before we wrap it up? I'm going to take one more look at the Q&A. And remember, you maybe haven't gotten far enough in the application to even know what your questions are yet. This might just be your first, run through. So if you have an opportunity to take a look at it before next week, I think the next workshop we're doing, which is the Q&A, is on Thursday. So feel free to kind of dig into it and then come back for that and ask some questions. Let's see. If we officially became a nonprofit formed beginning 2020 and are we still eligible? We don't have financials before 2020, but yes, previous years, that's exactly what we were talking about. As long as your nonprofit is current and in good standing, as of 2020, you can submit that letter of your nonprofit status, and then you give us that 3 years of programming history. You're definitely eligible if you're eligible in all of the other categories about being an arts and cultural organization. So sure. Do all organizations that know, Emily, you don't need it because you were not a past CAA recipient, so you don't need the data arts report. You will moving forward when we ask you for your first report if you're funded. But then we're going to have a couple of workshops. If anybody's not done the data arts report, they have lots of good customer support. There's a great workshop that they do for new applicants, and we'll make sure that everybody who is new to the program gets an opportunity to attend that. So, okay, well, I think we're done for today. Thanks everybody for coming and for hanging in for such a long time. And asking great questions. And again, take a look at the application. Please send us an email if you have questions about your eligibility. Sign up for a mentor, but maybe sign up for the mentor once you know what your questions are, because the time frames are pretty short. You'll have like a 15-minute time frame or a 30-minute time frame. So we ask that you use that time really wisely. So make sure you figured out what your questions are before you sign up for your mentor, but that'll be a really good opportunity to dig deeper if you need to. And we'll get everything up on the web and by next week, so you can refer to this and refer to the slides if you need to. And thanks for coming, and I hope I see lots of new applications come in, and I look forward to hearing from you all, and hopefully we can support as many of you as possible. So thanks again.